So now that we have this little animation here, we need to be able to get it out of the computer, get it out of Blender. So we're going to go hit 0 to get our camera view. And normally you want to animate things from the camera view just so you can see where they're moving. So here, obviously a lot of this is going off screen. If I want to change some things, for instance, the position, what I can do is move exactly over that line again so that it's highlighted yellow, and then move it down so that it's inside the screen. And then I have to hit I again. So I'll hit I and I'll change that location. So now as I scrub through it, it corrects to that spot. So you just have to make sure you're over that line. Now the other thing that's probably would be wiser to do is I could change the distance of my camera from the scene. So if I go to my top view, or this is a good time to go into quad view, I can move this guy back a little bit, and then I can go back to my cube and I can sort of see how this is working. I can grab this and sort of move it around. There we go. That looks pretty good. All right, so going back to that cube. So I've adjusted my camera. I only have one light in here, so I'm actually going to add a second light. So if I go to rendered view, I can sort of see how this is looking. So if I go to my off-screen view and hit Shift A and add another lamp, let's do an area light. It's pretty bright, huh? That's all right. I'll go ahead and pull down the brightness of that so that's not so overkill. Actually, maybe we'll go to Hemi. There we go. So now I have this good lighting. Now you'll notice as you're trying to scrub through it, it takes a little while for it to catch up. That's because it's trying to process a lot of information. So once you've got the lighting and texturing and everything set up how you want, just to save memory, I would say it's probably better to go back to solid view. One of the weaknesses of Blender is its rendering engine. It's not super powerful for stuff like this, but you know, it does pretty well. So now, before we render, we need to go ahead and check some settings. So again, 1920 by 1080 set to 100%. Our frame rate is 24 frames a second. Our aspect ratio, we want to leave that alone, 1:1. But let's go ahead and scroll down and take a look at some of these things. So first is anti-aliasing. Because we have a cube, we're not really going to notice this as much, but if you had a sphere, for example, and it was set to smooth, how anti-aliasing is calculated can affect the quality of that image. So normally you want a higher number and you want just a lot of size to it. But I would say do some experiments and see what you really need. So if I have this checked, and I'm going to uncheck full sample for a minute, if I were to render this now, so I'm going to go ahead and just render a still image, it gives me a pretty good looking image. If I set this to 16 and full sample, and then I'll hit escape and then render again, watch how long it's taking it to render it. I mean, it's really going, you know, block by block. So I'm actually going to go ahead and stop this by clicking on the X up here, but you don't want to have to do a full sample unless you need it. Now, if you're making, you know, a professional film and you have a lot of organic forms in there, yeah, you want to take that rendering time. That's just part of it. But for our purposes, setting this to 8 and unchecking full sample, that should be fine for this. Now the next thing we do want to check is sampled motion blur. So I'm going to move my playhead to some part where I can actually see that it's moving. Let's say right there. And it's defaulting to 1 sample and 0.5. But 1 sample basically says it's going to only render 1 frame. So if I click render, that's what it gives us. Now, if I say, let's do 3 samples, and I click render, you can see that it renders the 3 frames sort of next to it, and then it overlays them, so you get this sort of shaded view. Now, the shutter speed basically has to do with the degree. So if I set this to 0.1 and then I render it, you can see they're very close together. If I do 0.9 and render it, you can see they're further apart. So to some extent, you can experiment with this. I like to make this basically double my frame rate as much as I can, divided by 10. So I'm going to make this 48. And for those of you who shoot 4K on video cameras and end up using shutter speeds, sometimes you'll do something like this where you double the angle, or sorry, double the shutter speed. So I'm going to render that. And that just gives a sort of nice balance to it, I find. But again, this is a personal preference. But I'm definitely going to leave that sampled. Yes, it will take a little bit longer, but it adds a lot of realism to it. So for instance, if I render at the very beginning, you can see it's rendered all three images, but there's no overlap because it's a static object. Whereas if I render in between, where it's moving a lot faster, they're going to be farther apart. So this adds a lot of believability to your image. And you can increase the number of motion samples. If I did 5, it would do 5 frames around it. It's just going to take a lot longer. Finally, the really important one is output. So when you output an animation, you actually output it as a series of still images. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So we're going to go ahead and set first the output folder. So click on the folder icon. I'm just going to go to my desktop and I'm going to make a new folder and I'm going to call it Cube Renders and select Cube Renders. And I'm going to call this, you have to give it a name too, Cube. You usually want it to be something really short. Usually your last name would be helpful too, but it's going to generate a whole bunch of images. So if I say accept, that'll work pretty well. Now, normally your impulse is going to be to render out, where did it go, like a movie or an MPEG file or something. But the challenge with these is that if your computer crashes, you have to start all over again. And Blender tends to crash. So I'm going to choose JPEG. And I'm going to set it to RGB. The quality is going to be 100%, you know, go big or go home. And what it's going to do is it's going to render out a sequence of JPEGs. Now, because I have a sequence of JPEGs, if I hit escape to go back to here, I don't want to render all 240 frames. I really just want it to end maybe like right around here, a little bit after it stops. So let's say frame 49. So I'm going to change the end frame rate to 49. And now it's only going to render out those 49 frames. So once I have the save location set, the quality is set to JPEG, RGB, and the quality is set to 100, then I am ready to render the animation. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and save this real fast because I haven't saved it yet. Might be a good idea. Instead of clicking render, we're going to click animation. So I'm going to go ahead and get this started, but I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so it's finished rendering, and now I'm going to go and use a whole new window in here. So we're going to leave the UV image editor, and we're going to start using the video sequence editor. So I'm just going to introduce this to you now so that we can render out a movie, but we'll come back to this later when we start working with audio also. So go to video sequence editor, and we're going to go and add a sequence of images. So to do this, we'll go to Add, Image, and you might have to navigate to it. So if you had all those images rendered into a particular folder, it should look something like this. And then I'll say A for selecting all. I'll add the image strip. And then basically what it's doing is it's sequencing every one of those images one right after the other. All right, so we have this in here. Now, really we have two animations in here right now, basically. So we have the 3D animation, the 3D viewport animation. But then if we go back to the video sequence editor, this is actually a separate animation. So whatever we tell it to render, it's going to render whatever window is visible in here. So we have this pulled up. And now we're going to go ahead and render this as an MP4 file. So to do this, there's two steps. First, we need to change JPEG to the FFmpeg video. Now this might look weird, just bear with it. But you'll notice when we change that, we get this new option down here called encoding. So let's twirl down on encoding and check this out. It has a series of different presets, and a lot of these you can just use on their own. So the one we're going to be using is H.264 in MP4. And the H.264 codec is a really good high-quality compression codec. It'll make an MPEG-4 file. We can adjust the quality and the speed. I think for our purposes we'll leave it alone. And if we have audio in here, we'd want to set it to probably AAC or MP3. We don't have any audio in this file, so we don't really need to worry about that. So once we have this set up again using the H.264 in MP4. Then we'll go ahead and, I forgot one step. We want to save this as something else. So I've already set this up to be called cube_movie. It's going to save to the desktop. But you want to make sure that that name is clear so that it doesn't accidentally oversave one of your cube JPEG renders. Now I can go to animation, and it'll render it very quickly because it's already calculated out all of that other information before. You can see up here it's showing you how fast it's rendering. And now I can go to my desktop and I can try to find that file. There it is. It's an MP4 file, so pretty easy to animate or to email. And there's our animation, which looks pretty